Thank you all so much for being here this morning. This is a topic about which I have come to be very fond, thinking about how we can collaborate on back office initiatives. And I'm immensely grateful to all of you for spending some time with us here this morning. And of course, to my colleague Emily at Forefront and our panelists today. Should be a great conversation. I am Kate Piat-Eckert. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the director of the Mission Sustainability Initiative. The MSI exists to support organizations as they explore and implement strategic partnerships and sustained collaborations. And we do this in three core ways. We provide confidential consultations, which can look just like you and I on a Zoom screen. They're a space for thought partnership, informal guidance, a place where it's okay to not know what you're talking about in the world of how we develop sustained collaboration between nonprofits, and a place where no one else will learn what we talk about. We also connect folks with a huge range of resources around partnership strategy. Those can be referrals to consultants or pro bono counsel, toolkits, checklists, case studies, and of course, educational programs. And we do make grants to support some of the one-time costs associated with exploring and implementing these partnerships. And of course, we produce programs like we have today that I think help coalesce a community of collaboration in the nonprofit space. You are here today as in a group of like-minded people who are excited to explore the impact we can have when we work together. And that, for me anyway, is really something to celebrate. So thank you for being a part of this work. At the MSI, we look at a broad range of strategic partnerships, all of which share the goal of preserving, expanding, or improving the reach, impact, or efficiency of the services that nonprofits deliver to their communities. So it's not specifically about the work that we do, but about how we do that work. And we work with a range of organizational types, everything from arts to human services, environment, community organizing, and everything in between. And these partnerships represent multiple ways that organizations can do more together than they can on our own. Today, we're going to focus on the center column in this description and really talk about sort of the shared service back office options. But just I'm sharing this so you can see the range of options there are, the sort of menu that we have to look at when we think about how we work together. I hope we'll come away from today's conversation inspired to think a little bit differently, maybe about how some of your essential administrative work gets done. We all have a huge amount to do to keep our organizations thriving and running. And I think that today's conversation can hopefully plant some seeds around what are we doing ourselves that we could be sharing with others? What are we doing that we could be getting done another way to free up some space so that we can focus more on the mission and impact? So what do we mean when we talk about back office? I think it's, we might picture sort of a literal office with, at least in my mind, and this will date me, a bunch of folks with typewriters and telephones, but especially in smaller organizations where the same people might be performing administrative and programmatic service delivery functions and wearing a whole lot of other hats. The back office isn't necessarily a group of staff members or a literal office. If we think about sort of our mission, our programming, our services as what we do, sort of why we exist, I like to think about the back office as how we get what we need to do what we do. Sort of what are the people, the supports that we need to make sure that the work that we do is getting done. The back office is sometimes the sort of invisible support structure that makes our work possible and helps us keep track of what we've accomplished. That data piece is a really critical part of back office functionality as well. Often back office work is categorized in four core areas. We think about finance, human resources, technology, and facilities. Obviously, these are not clean lines between them. Sometimes there's some space that crosses over. But today we're really going to focus primarily on the finance and HR piece. You might have some ideas about technology and facilities back office collaborations as we're talking today. And I do think that I have some programming coming up that will specifically focus on those areas. But as I said, there's a bit of gray space between the four categories. But today's conversation will really focus on the sort of money and people management side of how we collaborate. And so how do we get this work done? So I think when I think about getting work done, I think about the sort of three categories. And I have found it's a pretty simple framework. Framework might be too glamorous of a term for three boxes, but I have found this framework to be really remarkably helpful in thinking about how we can identify things that we are doing ourselves and maybe find another way to get them done, or look at all of the things that need to happen to make an organization run and really slot how we're accomplishing them into one of these categories. Can really, for me anyway, open my perspective on how we think about how the work gets done. So when we talk about doing it yourself, that's sort of in organizational problems, be keeping something in-house. At home, that might be, unloading the dishwasher by myself, folding the laundry by myself. The framework works well in my human person life as well as in our organizational structures. Hiring someone might look like, contracting a service. The fee for service model is what we might call this otherwise. And then doing it together. And this is the collaboration space or strategic partnership space is really the bread and butter of the MSI's work. And this also, of course, works when we think about organizational structures. So before I joined the MSI about a year and change ago, I served as an executive director for a small nonprofit for about a decade. And I am well versed in looping far too heavily in the do-it-yourself in-house model. It never seemed like there was time or money or space to figure out any other way. So running our own payroll, doing our own janitorial services, sort of whatever that was, figuring out how to do it ourselves always felt like the first go-to. But when we explore some of our fee-for-service and strategic partnership options, I have found that we really can free up some organizational bandwidth to focus on service delivery and mission-based work. And so today we have an exceptional panel of folks who are going to walk us through what some of those options look like, specifically around our finance and HR work. So really filling in those second two boxes in the fee-for-service and strategic partnership space, specifically around nonprofit administration and back office collaboration. So I'm going to ask each of our guests to introduce themselves with a brief description on the perspective they bring to today's conversation. There's a lot of different ideas, a lot of different concepts, and all of these folks are polymath with a lot of different perspectives. So I'll give them a moment just to share sort of what they're bringing to today's conversation. So Erica, we might start with you. Would you share your name, organization, pronouns, and what you're bringing with us today?
Thanks, Kate. My name is Erica Spangler Raz. I use she, her pronouns. I am the managing attorney with Spangler Raz Law and Consulting, and I provide public charities with fractional general counsel and affordable, full, and limited scope legal services. So, in short, the perspective that I bring is really a legal framework and one of risk management.
Great, thank you, Erica. Derek, would you join us?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Derek Stovall Leonard. I'm the CFO of Forefront. In addition to overseeing our financials at Forefront, I am in charge of all of our earned revenue services. So I oversee our fiscal sponsorship program as well as Converge Consulting. As well, I oversee all of our administrative areas at Forefront, HR, IT. So I will be able to speak to contracting out some of those services as well.
Thank you, Derek. Courtney, welcome.
My name is Courtney Walker, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm a fractional CFO with Converge Consulting, and I provide technical support to the fiscal sponsor programs, as well as nonprofit clients that are under Converge Consulting. And so my perspective that I'm bringing to the conversation today will just be about the technical support for these organizations.
Thank you. And Laura.
Good morning, everyone. I am currently the executive director at Kwari Mani Foundation. I am she, her pronouns. And I was previously with Pierce Family Foundation. Pierce and Kwari Mani had a staffing relationship, a shared staffing agreement for about 4 or 5 years. So I'm here to talk about that.
Thank you. I would love to start our conversation with Erica. talking about the type of administrative collaboration that I most frequently get questions about. Erica, would you share with us some of the legal context for fiscal sponsorship and the differences between fiscal sponsorship and fiscal agency?
Sure, yeah, and I'm actually gonna take that latter question first. So the difference between fiscal sponsorship and fiscal agency, because these terms used to be used interchangeably often. I think it's getting better nowadays. And we always know what to look for in the contract when we're trying to figure out what exactly the relationship is. So legally, fiscal sponsorship is a mechanism that allows a tax-exempt 501c3 organization, which is the sponsor, to accept tax-deductible granted donations on behalf of a sponsored project. So the project is going to be individuals or a group that's working on an initiative. So when that 501c3 status is borrowed, the sponsor has the control and discretion over the final decisions on how those funds are used, or the funds are not tax deductibles or not tax deductible contributions. So with fiscal sponsorship, two key things are in place. One is that the project furthers the sponsor's exempt purpose. And the second thing is that the sponsor has control and discretion over the use of the funds. So in fiscal agency, the sponsor does not confer its tax exempt status because the project is already a tax exempt organization. So it's really primarily fiscal management, technical assistance, could include more depending on what's negotiated, how expansive the party's relationship is, like if they co-locate. But those are generally the two different things between fiscal sponsorship and fiscal agency. So I'm going to go through the different models for fiscal sponsorship because I think I'm a visual learner and I thought it may be helpful if we could look at some pictures to see how these relationships actually work for the different models. So, and one thing to keep in mind is that for fiscal sponsorship, it's a great collaboration model for projects that are collaborative alliances, coalitions. It could be short-term initiatives of a few years. But also think about in the grander scheme of things, if there's a handoff of a funded program from another tax-exempt organization that is sunsetting or dissolving, and this project needs a new temporary home until further strategic planning can be made, that's another great use of the fiscal sponsorship model. So let's start with the first, which is the most often used model called the comprehensive or the direct project model. In fiscal sponsorship parlance, we call this Model A. And that's where basically a project is not separately incorporated. It really is the sponsor's project. There's no separate existence. The project is integral to the sponsor's work. So think of it as just another program of the sponsor. The employees are typically the employees of the fiscal sponsor, and that fiscal sponsor assumes all responsibilities for the project and also all responsibilities as an employer. In Model B, which is the independent contractor model, is very similar to the first model, but this one's on the right of the slide. It's used much less often. The project is still integral to the sponsor's mission, so think of it as another program of the sponsor, but the sponsor contracts with an independent contractor to conduct the project. So the independent contractor could be a person or it could be an entity. So if we've got a consultant who has this idea for a project, it could be a single member LLC. It could be a separate nonprofit who has expertise in a particular area, but the project itself is not incorporated. It's just an independent contractor of the sponsor. The one thing to keep in mind for the independent contractor model is that ownership of the work, typically for independent contractors, the independent contractors typically own the work product that they create. So when we have this type of model, oftentimes the sponsor wants to own that work product, and that's something that's negotiated within that what we call Model B agreement, the independent contractor agreement. So Kate, if you want to go to the next slide, we'll go to the second most common model which is used. It's called the pre-approved grant relationship, and sometimes we see it as a grantor-grantee type of model. It's also called Model C in fiscal sponsorship parlance. So here we have this project is now separately incorporated, but it's not tax exempt. So it has its own board, its own compliance filings. It could be an employer. The people doing the work could be employees of the sponsor. That's all kind of negotiated. The key thing here, I think, is that with the project being a separate entity, it's going to work very closely with the sponsor, but it's going to own all of its work product. The project entity is going to apply for grants, and the donors are going to, or the foundations are going to give those grants to the sponsor. And there's going to be periodic reports so that the project entity can ensure that the sponsor is able to use those funds appropriately in accordance with relevant tax exempt laws. So there really is, this is probably the second most common, and it's when we have a project entity where the project itself needs limited liability, it has its board, it's kind of growing. We can move from that first model A to a model C, which is this one, this pre-approved grantor grantee relationship. And it's just a notice provision and open communication. So in all of these three fiscal sponsorship models that we've talked about so far, it's important to understand that all of the activities that are conducted by the project, all of those activities are attributed to the sponsor. And that's important, particularly in areas of alliances or coalitions, if there's going to be lobbying activity. And it comes into conversations early on in the projects, because the project's obligation is to ensure that the sponsor is able to comply with all the laws that apply to the situation for those activities. So you need open communication around planned activities for the project, so that if the sponsor is not registered as a lobbyist, it may have to do that, or do additional filings and things like that. So those are the first for the three models that we've talked about so far. The next model, which is what we called fiscal agency. So Kate, if you want to go to the next slide, again, just kind of a framework. This is where I mentioned before, we've got this separately incorporated project. It has income tax exemption. Many times this is kind of like the stepping stone of a previously incubated project under Model A or Model C typically, and it may need a little bit of hand holding. So, or building up of the support before it's able to have its own capacity for administrative services, employee or financial management services. Or it could be something that is very intentional, going to be, for years, or there's not a decision yet. That is all okay. So basically, this is really a great model for organizations where, they really want to focus on the mission and the programmatic activities. And there is another, fiscal agency relationship where there is competence and capacity to be able to handle those financial management aspects. And there can be other things like, social media or other development and communication, other back office services like co-location, but that's all really dependent on what that relationship is in the fiscal agency agreement. And that's really, again, a high level of those four different models.
Derek, you wear many hats at Forefront, including managing our fiscal sponsorship program. Could you tell us a little bit about how fiscal sponsorship works at Forefront and what organizations can expect from a fiscal sponsor?
Thank you. So as Erica explained, we predominantly support the direct contract model, where we will support organizations, and we have had some nonprofit organizations decide that they would want to utilize us as a fiscal sponsor for a particular strategic purpose, to receive a grant on their behalf, or as she alluded to, some organizations that are not classified as nonprofits predominantly will use that model for some specific purpose. We have the ownership of making sure that whatever it is that they're doing is charitable and will be in compliance with, obviously, our 501c3 status. And so we leverage that model. We also have several organizations that participate in our comprehensive fiscal sponsorship, where we try our best to give white glove service. And Courtney Walker, a member of my team, is on the panel as well, and she is our direct point person for our comprehensive fiscal sponsorships. And we also provide what we call technical assistance, or what we would say indirect fiscal sponsorship. And we do that through our Converge consulting services. We provide outsourced CFO services and accounting service to nonprofits and foundations across the state.
Thank you. It sounds like fiscal sponsorship is definitely not a one size fits all sort of one option program. Can you talk a little bit about how organizations sort of figure out what makes sense in a fiscal sponsorship relationship, or how the flexibility in how these relationships take shape works?
Yeah. So with Forefront, one of the things that I will say, it is not always a turnkey process. And what I mean by that is there are some online organizations that will provide, fiscal sponsorship where you can do a lot of crowdsourcing and those types of things. That is not what we do. We have a very collaborative, hands-on approach with the organizations in which we work with. And so it is probably about a 60-day process of us vetting each other to make sure that we are the right match. Secondly, really diving into their strategic plan to understand what is it that their goals are. There are some organizations that have made the firm decision that, hey, we only want to focus on our mission. And our job, what our goal is to align ourselves with a fiscal sponsor that we can consider ourselves at home and not necessarily bounce around and ever proverbially grow up and be our own separate organization. There are other organizations, as Erica alluded to, that decide to incubate themselves within a fiscal sponsor as they are getting their legs under them. And then at the 2 or 3 year mark, or whenever they determine that they're ready, they will decide to reevaluate the relationship and either move into another model or separate themselves and work independently. And so our job up front is really to understand what their end goal is so that we can align ourselves with the appropriate model to support them, one, from a cost perspective, but secondly, also from a support perspective and making sure that they ultimately achieve their goals.
I love that. One thing you just said I want to lift up, because it's something that comes up at the MSI all the time, is about letting our goals inform our structure. Sort of whether it's how we look at fiscal sponsorship or any other model, it's rather than trying to figure out how to make our programming fit into the structure we think we're supposed to have, figuring out what we're trying to be and where we're trying to go and crafting a structure that supports that is why we're all here. So that's really exciting. Thank you. Courtney, you work sort of on the day-to-day with fiscally sponsored organizations. Can you share a little bit about what that looks like, sort of what types of support you provide to organizations and what that relationship is like?
Sure, Kate. Sorry. As Derek said, at Forefront, we provide kind of a white glove service, or at least that's what we're trying to achieve for the fiscal sponsored organization. So we provide a lot of the back office services to businesses and individuals and nonprofits that are all engaged in charitable work. And there are a variety of reasons that our services are needed. To assist in the administration of grants, such as fiduciary oversight and HR support. But in my role, I assist in receiving the grants, the day-to-day accounting of those grants, processing invoices, reimbursement of expenditures, and just technical support, generating financial statements. So by offering those services, I also ensure that the expenses are allowable according to the grant agreement and that the funds are truly used for a charitable purpose. So, in my experience, in my time in this role, I've learned that there's, tons of moving pieces to making sure that Forefront is supporting these organizations and kind of tailoring our services to the missions of these organizations. But I think that all of from HR to the technical support, that we all share the same mission, and making sure that we're providing a safe space for the different organizations to either begin charitable work or continue their charitable work.
Great, thank you. Erica, there are several sort of less often explored options when we think about employing staff and managing finances. Fiscal sponsorship is maybe one of the best known, but how does fiscal sponsorship differ from outsourcing a part of this work to another organization, such as a fractional CFO or HR service firm, or a professional employer organization like a PEO? Are there sort of legal differences in how we think about fiscal sponsorship versus that kind of outsourcing?
There are some legal differences. One of the things that we probably want to keep in mind is from the fiscal sponsor, where we're talking about a non-exempt entity, so just separately incorporated, not tax exempt, or the comprehensive model, that direct project model. The fiscal sponsor is providing most of the HR and finance support for the most part. So it's not as relevant for those types of groups. When we're talking about an organization that has exempt status, then the fractional CFO services could be considered in very similar situations. I think of the deciding factor for a fiscal agency might be, the close working relationship with a fiscal sponsor, which may include something like informal mentoring of a new ED, or perhaps there's other services that might be included in a fiscal agency agreement, like co-location, elements of a shared resource agreement, particularly for perhaps the fiscal sponsor in those situations that needs to preserve property tax exemption. So I think, I think I mentioned before that, for fiscal agency, it can be a few years until you build up that internal structure or staffing. Could be an intentional way to streamline the administrative, finance and HR functions. For PEO, that's specifically for the administrative aspects of being a co-employer for the HR part. So that's best for organizations that don't necessarily need the other financial management services. So kind of viewing all of those together, there are legal differences, but I think that, you can find the right structure or the right option for your organization.
That's great. Thank you. Courtney, you often work in both spaces, both as a fractional CFO and in supporting fiscally sponsored organizations. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what that looks like? You're the person working directly with organizational leaders or their finance folks, sort of on the day-to-day basis. What do those differences look like?
Yeah, kind of to piggyback off of what Erica said, at Converge Consulting, it's really just more centered on the technical support. So we partner with these organizations to and tailor our financial services according to the needs of the businesses. And what this allows them to do is to focus on their mission, rather than focus on the accounting or technical support that they need in order to actually achieve those missions. So, and we market ourselves to and primarily work with in the nonprofit space, but we're still able to work with all businesses regardless of the organization structure. And there definitely is some overlap between the fiscal sponsorship and the fractional CFO services in some of the offerings and the technical support. But with fiscal sponsorship, we're essentially lending our 501c3 to an organization for a strategic purpose. And then with the fractional CFO, in general, the organizations that we work with already have their 501c3 status, and we're just providing more of the technical support in terms of accounting. So doing their bookkeeping, financial reporting, and again, those service offerings are tailored to the needs of business.
That's great. I know they are tailored and they're probably a little bit different for every organization. Can you drill down a little bit more into what we mean by those technical services? You mentioned bookkeeping and accounting. Sort of what does a meeting with an organization look like? Sort of what's the work that you're doing around board reporting? What does that look like? Or Derek, I saw you come off mute if there's anything you wanted to add to.
Yeah, I could jump in here. One of the things that we do is we really customize our services to the organization in which we're working with. And so when we talk about outsourcing the financial and accounting function, it really depends on the organization. For example, many organizations have started up grassroots and they have started doing their own bookkeeping. And so there may be an administrative assistant or someone that is actually keeping tabs on making sure that things are paid, recording certain entries. They just don't necessarily have the financial expertise to make sure that all accruals are booked appropriately. Things that should be amortized need to be amortized. And so in order to get that level of expertise, most organizations would have to hire a higher level accounting type person, maybe a CFO, a CPA, that would have that type of knowledge. That's where an organization like Converge comes in, because we can come in literally just at the end of the month to help that bookkeeper or that administrative assistant close the books and make sure that everything is in compliance and that it will meet any audit or any strict policies related to grants or any other regulations that those organizations have to subscribe to. Now, that's one model where we would just provide management services. The other model is the other extreme, is where we would actually wholly outsource the entire financial function. That means that we would actually be running their payroll. We would be doing all of the book entries. We would be cutting the checks. Oftentimes we utilize ACH payments. So we really try to transform the organizations that we work with to electronic payment. And that way we can set up the payments to be dispersed, but we do not approve anything that goes out. That will need to come from either the executive director or the appointed person within the organization. So really, it really depends on, again, how that organization is structured, the support staff that they currently have in place, and really what their budget is, because we can tailor our services to meet their budgetary needs.
Great, that is super helpful. Thank you for that clarity around sort of what that work really looks like. I know a little while ago I threw out a bit of jargon around PEOs, and Derek, you were actually the first person who introduced me to this concept. And I'm curious, sort of switching hats a little bit to your managing Forefront's administrative structure hat, if you could share with us a little bit about sort of what PEOs are and how you decided to work with one at Forefront instead of a more traditional payroll service.
Yeah, so one of the things that people forget sometimes is that Forefront in and of itself is a small nonprofit. And so we actually have to leverage our resources the same way that we advise other organizations to do. And so sometimes we are our own best guinea pig, if you will, before we would provide those types of consultations to other organizations. And so as the CFO of Forefront, as I mentioned, I oversee all of our administrative services. And so that is quite a pretty breadthy position in order for me to hold. And so I am definitely a strong proponent of outsourcing when appropriate. We have outsourced our IT services, and we have also leveraged the services of a PEO. A PEO is a professional employment organization. They are designed to leverage multiple organizations under one roof to get economies of scale when it comes to bulk purchasing of things like particularly employee benefits. And so prior to leveraging ourselves with the PEO, like many organizations, we were directly contracted with Blue Cross. And many of our employees fell into what we call an age bandit plan, which is the plan that most organizations will fall into until you get critical mass. And what that means is that the insurance is priced by age for employees. So if you are a 23-year-old employee that is single, your cost will be significantly less in most cases than someone that might be 45 or 46 years old, same sex, but again, just different age band. And so one of the things that there are a couple things we wanted to do. One, we wanted to smooth that out across our employee base so that there was more equitable pay or equitable costs in our benefits for our employees, first and foremost. The second thing is by scaling ourselves with a PEO, there is a professionalism, and I say that in air quotes, of benefits that a small organization couldn't really afford to provide. So, for example, when you think of a large corporation and their ability to offer sexy things like pet benefits or a EAP program or disability, not disability, but long-term care insurances, and some of those things that small organizations typically could not afford because of the breadth of services. A PEO allows us to do that at a fraction of the cost and at a much more efficient way to do that. And so our employees feel a lot more taken care of, if you will, and it eliminates a lot of the administrative back office hassle that we have to do from a financial and HR perspective internally.
That's great. Thank you. And correct me if I'm wrong, does it change sort of who the employer of record for the employees is? And if so, does that impact if liability for the organization around who is ultimately responsible for things like payroll tax filings and that employee liability?
Yeah, great question. So as Erica mentioned earlier, it is called leasing co-employment when you contract with a PEO. So what that is going to mean is your employees are going to get a W-2 that is from the PEO. So we actually leverage TriNet. And so TriNet is the employer of record, if you will. They are on their EIN. However, we have a separate EIN in which they will file all of our employee taxes, our withholding, and so everything. So there is a co-liability between the PEO as well as the organization. All personnel management decisions are made by the organization. The PEO never gets involved in any of those HR related activities unless there becomes a legal issue in which they will provide consultation, because again, they are jointly responsible for those decisions. And so many of those decisions are made in conjunction with the PEO in terms of terminations, if there ever becomes a situation where there needs to be a severance or any performance management issues.
That's great. Thank you. And Erica, we have looked already at several different sort of structural options for employing staff, either fiscal sponsorship, PEOs, and sort of other ways to outsource finance work. Are there unique considerations from a legal perspective if two organizations want to jointly employ a staff member? So rather than using a fiscal sponsorship, but have two different entities share a single staff member, is there a legal structure to talk about there?
Yes. So, so as Derek mentioned, the PEO is this co-employment model, and the benefit is getting, more affordable benefits, usually in addition to all of the streamlining of the administration of being an employer. Joint employment is typically a legal determination made by a government agency. So where both employee or entities are liable under the various employment laws. Both employers share or co-determine the terms and conditions of employment, even if that's indirect. So it's not typically a goal per se to be a joint employer because it means they're both liable. And typically we want to minimize liability. That said, what we're going to think about in this way is not necessarily the legal term of joint employment, but rather what we'll call in the nonprofit space shared services agreements by two nonprofits. In the structure of those agreements, typically there's going to be one primary employer. That employer is going to be responsible for payroll, withholding employment taxes, all of those kinds of things. The second organization is essentially an independent contractor of the first. So there's submission of monthly invoices, paying of monthly invoices. So this shared services agreement could also be, shared facilities. And I know that you have another program about that, but it is something to think about, an expanded relationship of collaboration, because a lot of these different things can be all put together into one agreement, particularly for organizations that have worked together before, or it could be, kind of baby steps. And we kind of start with this and then maybe explore one of those other programmatic collaborations that you are so good at talking about. So basically, in this shared services agreement, we've got this one primary employer and then the secondary organization is essentially an independent contractor of that primary employer. What's really important is for the supervisory structure to be discussed by both organizations in advance. This is incredibly important when we're talking about high-level employees like a CEO or an executive director, because those employees report to two different boards of directors, and there's provisions in these agreements that cover confidentiality. So there's a lot of things that can be addressed, but also a lot of streamlining. And I think there's one thing to keep in mind about these shared services agreements that's particular to nonprofits. And that's that the income generated by the shared services agreement, because one organization is paying essentially as an independent contract to the other, there is probably unrelated business income to that primary employer, even if the two organizations have similar missions. So we talked about fiscal sponsorship and how important it was in those situations for those missions to be similar in furtherance of the fiscal sponsors' exempt purposes and the charitable activities. In this type of situation, even if in a shared employment situation, even if the two organizations have similar missions, the primary employer has to report the unrelated business income tax because it's based on gross income on a 990T, which is a form that's filed with the annual 990 at the same time. And while the primary employer may not have to pay the tax, which is called UBIT tax, unrelated business income tax, because of the deductibility of the business expense, it still needs to file this form. And there's some exemptions. So I think in the end, it's really important to hire good counsel, to have really productive conversations before entering these agreements, and really understand the administrative complexity regarding sharing employees for tax-exempt organizations. All of that said, there are an incredible number of benefits that could be gleaned from this type of administrative sharing of employees.
Thank you very much. And Laura, you have worked as a shared staff member between two private foundations, and it's a good reminder for us that foundations also exist in the realm of nonprofit organizations. Could you talk a little bit about sort of how that came about, how that came to be?
Yes, like I said, I used to work with Pierce Family Foundation. I was part-time for many years, and then the last 2 years of the foundation's existence, I was full-time. We sunset at the end of last year. So Pierce, the background was that they were funding primarily homelessness and housing. And a man named Pete Willem, who had a family foundation of his own, the Kwari Mani Foundation, he found he was also funding primarily homelessness and affordable housing. And at that time, a smaller way, he was just getting into the foundation. And he found himself at a lot of the same meetings as Pierce staff, specifically Marianne Philbin and Heather Parrish. And he was like, well, they're really great and sound like they know what they're doing. I don't really want to hire my own staff. So, that's hard. And like I said, I just want Marianne and Heather. So we talked for about a year. And then the whole process, probably a year and a half, talked about it for like 6 months, and then worked out the actual details for about a year with the final MOUs and running it by an attorney and all that. But yeah, that's how it started.
Thank you. Have you encountered, as this has moved forward, any unexpected benefits or challenges in navigating sort of being a staff member supporting two different organizations?
Yeah, the benefits are, a wider view of the field. The two foundations probably shared about 60 to 70% of grantees or had common grantees, and then each had a bit more, sort of like a secondary focus area, a little bit different. So, learning, like I said, everybody, I think, learned a bit about organizations in the wider field that we would not have otherwise. One challenge is time management. Am I working enough for organization X? Am I shortchanging organization Y? Because it wasn't, you know, billed hourly, right? We were all just doing our jobs. There was a monthly fee. I'll back up a minute. We came up with a fee and per month for the use of the staff, and we invoiced Pierce, because I was Pierce invoiced Quarry Money quarterly for that. And like I said, that amount was agreed upon ahead of time. It was based on annual salaries, not any hourly work. So yeah, the time management, and we were all employed with Pierce Family Foundation. And like I said, and so Quarry Money paid us. There wasn't like a joint fund that everybody contributed to. I got my paycheck from Pierce. Quarry Money just paid. Essentially, it was a fee for service arrangement. So I would say the time management was the biggest issue. You know, like I said, am I spending enough time doing things specifically for Quarry Money? That particularly became true the last year of Pierce's existence, because we were sunsetting and there was just a lot of work going in there. So any of those grantees that Quarry Money had that were their own grantees that were not common between the two foundations, I didn't take the time to learn about a lot of those. I'll be honest. I read their applications. I wrote them up. But I did not take time to do the sort of specialized relationship building I would have otherwise.
I want to lift up something you just said about sort of it being a partnership and a fee for service model. I think that really highlights sort of in the framework I laid out in the beginning, how there's the do it yourself and then a bunch of other ways to do it with other people, how there's a lot of crossover in that space. And Erica, I saw you nodding enthusiastically during that. I was just wanted to add about that idea.
No, I was actually just agreeing with you. I had a separate question for Laura, but please, you know, go ahead and ask your question. Was there?
No, go for it.
Oh, so Laura, you had mentioned about the time, and I think that it's something that organizations really have to consider when they're entering these, because many times organizations don't require their staff, or you know, a number of staff, they don't keep timesheets. And I was wondering about your experience in were there conversations about having to track time even loosely about what you were spending your time on? You know, you had mentioned making sure that you spent enough time on the other organization, but how was that ensured, and what were the you know, day-to-day aspects of tracking that?
Blissfully, neither Dennis Pierce nor Pete Villum are that interested in tracking anybody's time. I think that is, you know, something that is definitely, and they kind of knew that and trusted each other going in. And so a lot of it is the relationship, you know, the two organizations might have going into the arrangement. Like I said, blissfully, I did not have to deal with that. That is something that I would recommend making very, very clear, though. If you are expecting staff members to track their time, I would make that very clear going in.
That's really good. One of the reasons that I had brought up this kind of time management when you had mentioned it is that for some organizations, if there are any staff where their time is attributable to grants, or particularly government grants, sometimes those are conversations that the partners do need to address.
Yeah.
Like you had said, very transparently upfront, but also understanding the reasoning behind that. You know, it's a different situation when you have two private foundations that have different, you know, expectations about managing time and tracking that, then when there are other transparency requirements and accounting requirements behind that. So
yeah, government grants, of course, you know, take staff time into account. So, and certainly any agreement you could come up with could be specific for some staff and not for others. You know, or some grants and not for others. If you're sharing a grant writer, this is when we need to know your exact hours. These are the grants we don't care. You know, I like I said, you know, one of something that Kate and I talked about, touched on when we did our prep call a long time ago, is being just extraordinarily specific in your MOU. And, you know, like I said, that grant writer one is a really great example for that. 'Cause, yeah, there's a lot of I used to be a grant writer. Any foundation that I was submitting a grant to did not care how many hours it spent. But for the government ones, yeah, I'd have to track that. So
That's another really good reminder about how is this sort of menu of options in the realm of collaboration, but there's so much opportunity for sort of a la carte refinement in these options, that just because something looks like, I'm not sure if that would work for my organization, there are ways to tweak it, adjust it, and really, as Derek and I shared earlier, sort of make the goals inform the structure. It
even
sounds like
within, yeah, even within our specific example, there were some staff who were not included. Pierce had 4 staff. We had co-executive directors. I was part-time, and then we had a full-time IT program officer, essentially, because technology for nonprofits was a big part of our work. And Corey Monty wasn't interested in joining us on that. So we very specifically wrote the MOU that he was not included in this, that we could revisit it in the future, but he was not included his time.
That's a great example. Thank you. I am going to, I think, wrap us up with a bit of a lightning round for all of our panelists. And while I'm doing that, we've already gotten some great questions in the chat and the Q&A, whichever you want to use is fine by us. So feel free to get your questions ready. But the 4 of you come from such a variety of different perspectives. So the legal perspective, the perspective of being a shared staff member, the perspective of someone sort of administering organizational sort of admin, finance, HR, and someone doing the actual day-to-day finance work for organizations. So 4 really unique perspectives on this work. And I think as organizations, sort of the folks who are here with us today, are considering their options for back office collaboration, what questions should they be asking themselves? Is there anything that comes to mind as don't move forward until you've started really digging into this question for yourself? And B, what advice do you have around considering the models that we've talked about today? Is there anything you want to share with the people here in the audience today to take away with them as they work through all of these options? So maybe we'll start with Erica, since we started with Erica before. Either or a question folks should ask themselves, or a piece of advice as they navigate all of these models.
One in both. Thanks, Kate. So I think the main thing to keep in mind, and I probably should end with this, but the main thing to keep in mind is whatever your goals are, and again, I'm using from the legal lens, is that we can usually structure something that works. So what matters most is, what are you trying to do? And then we'll figure out what kinds of agreements, what provisions need to be in that agreement, how it should work on a practical level, and give advice. So long as the organizations are having really good, productive conversations, and there may be some draft MOUs in advance of an actual final executed agreement, and that's kind of typical of the process. But something just to really keep in mind is, what are you trying to do? Have transparent, collaborative, open, honest conversations. And usually we can take it from there, whatever structure it is. If it's a shared resource agreement, or a shared staffing agreement, or if it's something that's more expansive, that it's really just technical assistance or fiscal agency or something like that. Particularly for organizations that have that the handoff of a project to another organization, which is part of that collaboration model. The couple questions that I have, just to kind of organizations to think about, particularly because this comes up so much, and I know that it's not, a fiscal sponsorship is not everything, but because there are so many alliances and collaborations that kind of form, and they may have short-term initiatives, to think about for the fiscal sponsor that you're thinking of working with, really kind of look at their financials and make sure that they have 3 to 6 months cash on hand, that they are financially stable, so that they're not tempted to, use funds that were restricted for your project. The other thing to keep in mind is that if you have one of those program transfers to another that needs like a home, make sure that the organization has the mechanisms and capacity for, you know, whatever it is that you're collaborating, particularly if it's around government grants that we had said, because there is administrative and accounting complexity related to those types of organizations. So I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. Derek, what questions should folks be asking themselves, and what advice do you have for our group?
I would say a little bit similar to what Erica suggested. However, I would add really doing an inventory of where your expertise lies, and understanding the people that you actually have within the organization and how they best can be positioned to achieve the mission of the organization. Many times, because we are small organizations, we have to end up going with an all hands on deck approach. And sometimes we end up putting people in positions that they aren't necessarily best suited for. They would be best suited for, you know, really moving the needle on achieving the mission versus trying to learn bookkeeping and or HR and or benefit management. And so as you look at what your mission is and the inventory of the people that you have within the organization, I would do your best job to figure out how to best augment those administrative tasks so that you can move the needle on advancing the mission best.
Thank you, Derek. I feel very seen in my former executive director role there. And that's great. Thank you. Courtney, does anything come to mind for questions folks should ask themselves or advice you want to share?
I think that Erica and Derek did a really great job of addressing a lot of the questions that I would have brought up, but I think it's also important to have an understanding of the time frame with which you want to do everything. So we have, as Derek alluded to previously, we have about a 60-day timeline in order to onboard any of the programs. And that's really to get an understanding of the mission, what services need to be provided, and you know, just setting the framework for the entire partnership. And so it's really, you know, you have to take a look at the time frame with which you want to do everything and see if it's realistic. So that, I mean, that would be in addition to what both Erica and Derek said. I think that's important to also keep in mind.
That's great. And yes, I think that reminds me of what Laura was saying about how the shared staff agreement took over a year to come to fruition. I think that's a really, really good reminder.
Yeah.
Laura, what questions should folks think about, or what advice do you have?
I appreciate what Derek said about knowing your staff and knowing the people involved, and I just want to echo that. And then I want to emphasize again that like a lot of that was that year plus was, you know, just the trust being built between those, you know, really those two agencies. I would recommend more, you know, multiple conversations if you're considering multiple ideas, I guess. You know, what would this look like? What might that look like? I wouldn't settle on the first idea you have. Not that it's not the best idea. And then, like I said, you know, that's my advice is to just specifically a shared staffing is to be as specific as you possibly can. I think our MOU is like 3 pages, and it was like a lot of this is what staff will do. This is what staff will not do. And then my other recommendation is, particularly in a shared staffing arrangement, to have a lawyer review your MOU for UBIT, which is unrelated business income tax. And ours cleared it. You know, it was like, this is very clearly a mission match and a fee for service, not, you know, if we had started doing shared staffing with, you know, somebody that wasn't in homelessness and housing, maybe the lawyer would have had a different opinion. But getting that clear just to make sure that you don't have any problems down the line is really important also.
That's great. Thank you all so much for this exceptional guidance. We are so lucky to have you with us today. I have a few questions that have already come in the chat, so I'll field those. And as folks have other questions, please feel free to add them. This first one is for Derek. Does an organization that chooses a PEO model continue to file their own 990 and maintain their own EIN? That is the question.
Yeah, 100%. Again, the staff is going to be recorded in your accounting system. So they are your staff. We record it literally as if we were booking our own payroll, because again, those taxes are going to be filed, and it is going to be associated with your organization. So yes, the only thing that is being handled outside of your organization is literally the tax filings for your employees, employee-related taxes. But yes, your 990 is going to continue to be filed. There is no change there at all.
And if organizations were looking to not have their own EIN and file their own 990, that's more of a fiscal sponsorship conversation, right?
Comprehensive fiscal sponsorship, yes.
Great, thank you. Erica, how does it impact dual employment if one of the organizations is unionized? Do you have a sense of that?
Okay, so collective bargaining agreements are fairly complex and it's a very specific area of law. So I would say that it's probably too complex to address here. However, how this would typically play out is there would be some negotiations. And then I guess I'm thinking of like a shared staff kind of agreement for joint employment as opposed to a PEO. But for those types of agreements, it would be addressed in that agreement. And it would also need to be addressed in a collective bargaining agreement, because so both two agreements are in alignment with each other, if that makes sense.
It does, thank you. Yeah, I think it's another good reminder that there's a lot of complexity depending on the specific goals and the specific structure of each organization, but all these things can be figured out.
And
Great.
Derek, I don't know if you know if there's any PEOs that because I'm not, because it's PEO specific about whether or not they would take on unionized employees, because it's for the payroll benefits issues.
Yeah, I'm not certain. If there were, there is a large gradation, I will say, of different types of PEOs. There are local PEOs where you may be able to get a little bit more, what I would call white glove service, and individuals that will actually help you more with your day-to-day HR management. But there are larger ones such as ADP, TriNet, Paylocity that also offer those services. I would say if there are PEOs that would get into collective bargaining and other unionized labor forces, it will probably be one of the larger ones because they will be more equipped, have larger legal departments that will be able to support you.
Thank you both. There are a lot of ways to get started in the ideas that we've talked about today. The MSI exists as a bridge, as a connector between lots of different resources. So if you have questions about, and you're not quite sure whether they fall into a PEO conversation or a fiscal sponsorship conversation, or sort of where that path might take you, please feel free to reach out to me. As I said at the beginning, that is literally why I'm here, is to help organizations navigate all of the options that exist around ways we can get what we need to do our work better together than we can on our own. So I hope you'll reach out. Feel free to schedule time to talk. You can also learn more about the work of all of our panelists at their websites there, and feel free to explore and learn about the many, many options that exist for you. Thank you again for joining us and for all you do to support a vibrant social impact sector in Illinois.